All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to the latest installment of the Non-Degree Credentials Research Network's year-round webinar series. Today we have a really exciting presentation on exploring what drives credentials of value in community colleges. We have two really distinguished speakers that we're really honored accepted our invitation. Uh, I'll introduce both of them. Harry Holzer. He has, by the way, one of the more extensive Wikipedia pages of any NCRN member or credentialing researcher that I know of. So if you want to read about his early life, it's there. Important points are that he was the chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor during the Clinton administration and has been a really engaged researcher, doing research on a variety of topics around the school to work transition and labor market transitions and the returns to higher education, and is affiliated with Georgetown University. Um, Rachel Cook is a senior researcher with AIR, American Institutes for Research. She's done a lot of work on TANF and other programs administered by the Labor Department and Department of Health and Human Services. Very accomplished mixed methods researcher. And I think in today's presentation, we'll definitely see how that combination of qualitative and quantitative evidence as we shed some light on what community colleges are doing and how they're thinking about non-degree credentials of value. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to our speakers.
Um, I'll take the first crack at this. Thank you, Kyle.
Mhm.
And thanks to Michelle and Melissa and the whole team of NCRN at Rutgers for hosting us today. And looks like we have a decent crowd for a July seminar. So thank you all for joining us. This is joint work with a whole bunch of people at AIR, the American Institutes for Research. Obviously, my co-author, Rachel Cook, who will present all of the qualitative evidence today. In addition, other co-authors were Amy Fagan, Anna Jefferson, Paul Butler, and Liz Rutschow. And I want to give a special shout out to Liz because early on in the project, when she was still at AIR, she really developed the qualitative analysis and oversaw all of its implementation. So special thanks to Liz for all that. The idea of this body of work, and by the way, if anyone wants to see the actual written material, it's on the Credentials of Value website at AIR, and there's actually four briefs, one on the quantitative evidence, one on the qualitative, and then implications for practice and policy. And we'll just be trying to summarize all of that today. But the idea is very simple. Why is it that some public community colleges are better at others than generating credentials with labor market value? And we'll show you how we define that in a few minutes. But the idea being, if we can see what distinguishes the stronger and somewhat weaker performers, maybe we can learn about how some places can improve the value of the credentials they generate. So next slide. So we want to cover four things today. The first will be simply a little bit on motivation. Why did we think this was an important topic to explore? Secondly, we'll talk about the design. This is very much a mixed methods study, quantitative work and qualitative work. Thirdly, we'll discuss the findings a little bit on the quant side, much more on the qualitative side. And then number four, what are the implications for practice, but also for policy and for future research? Next slide. Next. So, why does this matter? I think it's fairly obvious. I think many of you are probably interested in the same question. Credentials of value matter a lot for economic mobility. If you look at the population of students who enroll in community colleges, and keeping in mind that community colleges in many places are open enrollment institutions for anyone with a high school diploma or a GED, a lot of the students, compared to almost any other higher ed institution, come from the low income community, communities of color, working parents, and others, people who are really looking, first generation college, especially people who are really looking to get some upward mobility. out of whatever credentials they earn here. So, access to the community college is already high. Completion's also very important. We know a lot of people do not necessarily complete a credential there, but access and completion, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient for upward mobility. We need the credentials to have labor market value in order to really propel people upwards. And, we know that there's enormous variation in the labor market value of a lot of the credentials that community colleges generate. There's been a lot of work on this in the last couple of decades, especially using a lot of the administrative data that so many of us have used. So just a couple of facts. Number one, uh, associate degrees in the liberal arts, when used as terminal credentials and people enter the labor market, they have very little labor market value. They have more value, perhaps, as a stepping stone in transferring to four-year colleges and universities. But in the labor market on their own, they have little value. But even within the workforce side of the house, there's enormous variation, and a lot of that variation is within fields. So, for instance, if you look at healthcare, some of the shorter certificates in healthcare, like certified nurse assistants, have fairly limited economic value, whereas some of the others, more the technician side, LPNs, et cetera, have much more value. So understanding, again, why some institutions are better than others at creating the value, I think will be important for us if we want to further economic mobility for these populations. Next slide. So we have to start with a definition of what we mean by credentials of value, and also which uh, which credentials and which fields we're actually going to focus on. We define workforce programs quite broadly as being anything at community colleges outside of the liberal arts. So obviously encompassing healthcare and business and IT and advanced manufacturing, et cetera. In this study, we can only focus on the for-credit credentials because we use the IPEDS data, and that's all that they have. We're aware of the fact that non-credit value is increasingly important and that a lot of people in the NCRN network focus on that, but we had to focus only on the for-credit side. And we developed a definition of credentials of value. It's any credential that generates average annual earnings of at least $45,000 a year for certificates, $50,000 for associate degrees. So a slightly different threshold. Those numbers may seem a little arbitrary to you. We know that they are. They are, when we looked at the whole distribution of earnings generated by these degrees, it's what struck us as being sort of the higher, the upper, not the upper tail, but really, the upper third to half of all credentials, the ones most associated with living wage jobs. We did play around with different thresholds just to see if they mattered for our findings. And most of what we talk about here is really quite robust to using different thresholds. But very importantly, of course, in our work, we controlled for inflation over time and also for differences in regional cost of living to make these numbers comparable across regions. Next slide, please. Next. So let me kind of explain our methods, and there are really kind of four parts to what we did here. So we started with IPEDS data, and we looked at the roughly 1,000 public community colleges in the country in the IPEDS data. We took 11 years from 2011 to 2021, which was the data that were most complete when we started our work. And for each institution, we started with all of the credentials that they generated in each year for their students. And then we identified a subset of them that had the labor market value on average. And I'll tell you how we do that in a minute. And then we ended up linking those community colleges to other data from the American Community Survey and from the BLS. But what we did was the following. So we have the CIP code for every credential generated in every community college every year. The CIP codes, of course, are field of study. So we needed a crosswalk from field of study from CIP code to occupational code. And there's a few of those crosswalks available. If you've ever used them, you know that they're a little on the messy side. There's nowhere near a one-to-one correspondence. Um, but each CIP code, you can identify a set of occupations and what fraction of the people uh, with that CIP code are in the different occupational categories. And then we take average annual earnings from the ACS within each state for each occupation. And you sort of do a weighted average of those occupational earnings for each CIP code in our data. And that's how we get the annual earnings. And that's how we can figure out which are credentials of value and which aren't, which meet our thresholds. Now, what we did here to link these to our colleges was we run a big panel data regression. The dependent variable is the number of credentials of value, certificates plus associate degrees, being generated each year by each college. And we ran those on three control variables: the number of enrollees every year, the size of the local population, and the local unemployment rate. So controlling for basic demographics and business cycle. And we added a dummy variable then for each college. We call those college fixed effects in a panel data regression. So we run the regression. There's a coefficient on each college, kind of reflecting their average ability to generate credentials of value. And then we use those to rank the colleges from top to bottom. Those coefficients from the most positive to the most negative are summary measures of which colleges were good or not good at this. Then we have all the colleges ranked from top to bottom. Then we took those coefficients on the college, measuring each college's ability, and then we ran another set of regressions where those are the dependent variables, and there's only one observation for each college. And then we tried to simply look at all of the different correlates, the quantitative correlates of the colleges of how well they do on this measure. And very obviously, none of this, we can't claim that any of this is truly causal. That's true of all of our work, but we thought it'd be interesting to see which characteristics of the colleges, of their regions, maybe of their states, are correlated with high ability to generate these certificates of value. So we'll show you those results in a few minutes. Then we also took so that's the quantitative part of the study. Then the qualitative part that Rachel is going to present in a few minutes, we took subsets from the very top of the rankings and from the very bottom, maybe the top 2 or 300 versus the bottom 2 or 300. We labeled the top ones excelling colleges. We labeled the bottom ones aspiring. And we tried to pull a set of colleges whom we could interview about what they think, what they do to help generate these credentials of value. What we tried to do is we tried to match the top and bottom, the excelling and aspiring colleges, by some of these characteristics as a way of controlling for them. So, like sometimes those comparisons are done within state, sometimes they're done across states with similar demographic characteristics, like California and Texas. Are very different states and have very different college systems, but their demographics are fairly comparable. And that was our way of trying to control for as many of these characteristics as possible. So I'll just show you a few of the quantitative results, and then I'll turn it over to Rachel. Next slide, please. So in the quantitative results from those correlations between the college ranking and these other characteristics, 4 things jumped out at us. The first thing is that the type of institution matters a lot, meaning, was it a technical college or not? There's a handful of states where a lot of their community colleges are actually technical colleges. And by our measurement, those strongly outperformed the more comprehensive community colleges. Now, and we identified them based on name. And some people say, well, that's not a very good way of identifying. And yet we still got very strong results. If there was a lot of measurement error in those names, it would bias things towards 0. And yet still we got very strong results. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? That's the bread and butter of the technical colleges, is not so much helping students transfer to 4-year, but really preparing them for good jobs in the labor market. So that, And it's not like we're going to turn all the community colleges into tech colleges, but maybe the broader colleges can learn something from what the tech colleges do. A second thing we found was that all else equal, the size of the college measured by the number of full-time enrollees had a big, was positively correlated with credential value. We have a few hypotheses if that's causal, and we think it might well be. Uh, the large colleges, of course, have big economies of scale, so they can afford to put resources both into the academic side and into the workforce side. And perhaps also the biggest community colleges are most visible in their regions and to the key employers. So we think that matters. Third, region really mattered. On average, the southern states outperformed lots of other regions, and in particular, outperformed the Northeast region. Um, but within those regions, individual states also had a lot of variation. So, we note two here. Indiana scored very strongly. Of course, Indiana has the Ivy Tech college system, and that's a particularly effective technical college system. But then there's other states like Mississippi, and it was less obvious to us why those mattered. One last thing on this. Sometimes we ran different regressions with the state dummies, sometimes with fewer controls, sometimes more controls, to see which characteristics of states seem to be highly correlated with the state ranking. And I'll just mention a couple of things we found. One of them is that all else equal, the percent of the adult population with BA degrees um, has a big negative effect on the extent to which the community colleges crank out these credentials. And of course, the reason for that is pretty simple. We think, the the sons and daughters of those families where people have BAs want to get BA themselves. So the community colleges put a lot more emphasis on transfer to 4-year and a little bit less on the workforce function. Again, all else equal. That kind of made sense. And we think that's why the Northeast falls somewhat short in our analysis. One other characteristic that was quite interesting of the colleges was the percentage of the faculty that have tenure in the community colleges. It didn't always come in. That percentage in some regressions came in negative and significant, not in all of them. But it was at least a hint that maybe something about governance, that where the faculty are mostly tenured, that's mostly liberal arts faculty, and they have a big say in terms of the allocation of resources across academic and workforce functions. So some of the interesting findings, and let me turn it over to Rachel, who's going to focus on the qualitative work.
Great, thanks, Harry. So I'm going to pick right up, and we talked a little bit about the segmenting of the colleges into excelling and aspiring. And then we really wanted to, as Harry described, dig in and explore what practices differ across those colleges and if they vary by context, some of the things that Harry was just talking about, college type or local economy. We did interview leaders at 35 colleges, 47 individuals, if I remember correctly. The bulk of those were in excelling colleges, 25 with 10 in aspiring colleges. We did conduct outreach sort of equitably between those groups, but those are the individuals we ended up being able to talk to. And I will kind of walk through what our findings were from the qualitative analysis, but I do want to just give a caveat that this is a, oh, and I should have said next slide, I'm sorry. Thank you. That this is a relatively small sample. So, take that with a grain of salt. They're best understood as a starting point, but they really do give us helpful insight about what's happening on the ground. Next slide. Okay. So Harry was talking about the wonderful work of my colleagues, including Liz Richtow, and Amy Fagan, who did a lot of really strong work thinking about the framework for our data collection and analysis for this project. So we structured our analysis around three key areas that were drawn from prior research on effective workforce programs. The first is occupational skills training. And so we've listed some example practices here on the slide. On the left side, focus on high wage and demand industries, preparing students for direct entry into specific careers, and aligning training with local labor markets. Then that second bucket is employer involvement. So the extent to which colleges are working with employers to drive curriculum, provide work-based learning opportunities, and so on. And then on the right-hand column, we see student supports and advising. So that's our third bucket, really just the extent to which colleges provide supports to help build workplace skills, address barriers, and other things. So we really think about these as the major levers that colleges have. And we dug into the interviews to really explore how colleges operationalize those in practice. Next slide, and then one more. So the most important takeaway I want to leave you all with is that the differences between colleges was really incremental. It wasn't all or nothing. Nobody was doing nothing, effective or successful. Most colleges are doing similar things, but what we really took away from these interviews is what really sets excelling colleges apart is how consistently and intentionally they're doing some of these practices, how they combine them, and how intensive those efforts are. So it's not about having a single silver bullet. It's really about aligning multiple practices in a comprehensive way. And I think that's really encouraging from a practice perspective because it means that many colleges are already at least part of the way there. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about some of our findings around these framework areas. So first, like I said, nearly all colleges were doing a lot of the same things. They almost all said that they align their programs with labor market demands. But we did hear more from excelling colleges about building deeper ongoing relationships with employers, not just getting occasional input. So, we would hear from pretty much everybody. They're talking to, employer advisory boards, but the excelling colleges were involving employers in program design, talking about hiring faculty with industry experience, and also importantly, not just aligning programs with job availability, but also looking and considering job quality and making programming decisions. So I think, yep, you can actually go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so then funding is another key difference that we saw between the colleges. Excelling colleges were more likely to talk about combining multiple funding sources. So they talked about state dollars as well as federal resources, resources and donations from employers themselves, either cash or resources, materials, building space, things like that, and then philanthropic resources. So that really allowed excelling colleges to reduce costs for students and help them better to sustain and grow their programs over time. And then aspiring colleges really did often talk about relying on a narrower set of resources that were more unstable, like grants, and on the flip side, made it difficult to sustain programs. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, so career readiness. I think here, excelling colleges we talked to were more intentional. Again, most people were talking about career readiness, but they were more intentional about teaching workplace skills, things like communication, professionalism, reliability, and sometimes that was embedded into the technical courses themselves. sometimes being, grading students, having a portion of their grade be on attendance or professionalism. And sometimes it was a standalone class or requirement, like a job prep course, or other activities like integrating teamwork and communication into technical assignments within classes. And I think one college leader, I will just add, said, talked about it as teaching students how to show up for work, which, I think sounds simple, but employers do consistently highlight that as a critical gap for students entering the workforce at times. Okay, next slide. So I think finally, work-based learning does also vary. We found across the colleges that we talked to, excelling colleges were more likely to say that they offered a variety of opportunities. I mean, most people did have elements of work-based learning, or most colleges had elements of work-based learning, but excelling colleges talked about, in addition to things like internships and apprenticeships, things like having employers come in and do site visits on campus and in classrooms, practicums, and project-based learning with real employers. This matters, I think, because students do learn different things in different settings. So I think the takeaway here is not just to offer work-based learning, but to expand and diversify those opportunities so students have a lot more access to those different learning environments. Next slide. So we took these findings and developed a set of practice and policy recommendations. I'm going to talk about the practice recommendations, and then Harry, I'll pass it to you to talk about policy. These are going to sound familiar because I just kind of went over these, but here on the slide, we came up with 5 takeaways from everything that I just shared. The first is going to sound relatively intuitive, but it is to align programs not with just jobs that are in demand, but jobs that pay well. Second, to engage employers more deeply, not just occasionally, but really as ongoing partners. Third is to expand access to work-based learning in meaningful ways. Fourth, really to integrate career readiness across programs, not just as an add-on, but a thoughtful component to programs and courses. And then fifth really is to provide strong advising and wraparound supports. And I didn't talk about that when I was going through our findings, really because supportive services and advising were common elements across all of the workforce programs and colleges that we talked to. But again, I think we did see some examples of more robust support systems among excelling colleges as well. So again, I think these aren't brand new ideas, but I think that what's really important, what we're seeing is the emphasis on doing these things consistently, intentionally, and together was a real distinguishing factor of excelling colleges. And I'll kick it back to you, Harry.
Thank you, Rachel. Next slide, please. So here we list some policy recommendations, more for state policy than federal. And again, let's acknowledge that key caveat. We know that these results are not strictly causal. So we have to consider these policy recommendations as sort of suggestive rather than definitive. But the results do, I think, suggest some possible things for states to do. Number one, if we care a lot about the earnings of the credentials of students, and we want states to work harder at improving those, you can incentivize community colleges to pay more attention to that by using some kind of performance-based or outcomes-based funding, and using as a criteria of the funding the average earnings of recent graduates. Now, many states, probably most states, do some kind of version of outcome-based funding, but they do it very differently, to very different extents, and they look at different outcomes. Among states that are starting to look at the earnings of college graduates, Texas has developed a new system that really stands out. For Texas, the strongest determinant of the subsidy, the state subsidy to the institution is the average earnings of their graduates. Now, we all know, and there's a literature on performance-based effects. We know that when we reward public institutions for performance, that they can often try to game the system. The best way, the easiest way to game community college outcomes would simply be to do cream skimming, right? To let in only better students to make your numbers look better. So that's a big caveat for this work. If you want to avoid that, you can have the earnings of key demographic groups like low income folks. But that's an area where we'd like to see more states experiment and then really rigorously evaluate the effects. Other possible state policies are to provide technical assistance to support employer involvement, since, as Rachel indicated, everybody engages with employers, but some do it in a more powerful way than others. And also providing funding for robust academic and career advising for students. And there, the literature, the rigorous quantitative literature, is really growing stronger on the importance of those supports. Finally, we note that federal policy could also play a role here, that the Higher Ed Act or other legislation could also provide funding for any of these things we mentioned above, as well as for workforce Pell, data collection and data analysis. One more slide, please. And then, we obviously recognize this is really the beginning, what we hope is the beginning of a research agenda rather than the end of it. We think a lot more research is needed. First of all, why do some colleges choose to engage in what appear to be stronger practices than others? What are the variables that determine, what economists would call selection into these activities? What are the contextual factors, et cetera? We need to know more about that. And of course, we also need more research on implementation. We know implementation of these practices is really critical, as Rachel indicated. Other local and regional factors like the availability of high-wage jobs or the quality of institutional leadership might matter. We'd like to look at those. And then, of course, going back to that basic fundamental point, we really need more research that would indicate the extent to which these practices are causal. And we hope to see more of that. So we think we've put some findings on the table that we hope will stimulate other scholars to do this work while they think about the practice and policy consequences. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Harry and Rachel. A lot of this was a very thought-provoking presentation. I can start with just kind of start off the conversation. I'll start by asking you to talk a little bit more about how you determine alignment between fields of study and occupations. I know that I was reading your paper and you mentioned the SIPSOC crosswalk, although you did some weighting, did some weighted averages in cases where there were multiple occupations associated with the field of study. Can you talk a little, for those who haven't read the paper, can you talk a little bit more about what you did there and why you went with the SIPSOC crosswalk? Or if you gave any thought to other ways of thinking about this kind of fit between occupations and fields of study.
We thought the crosswalk was the best way to accomplish this. Now, we could have started with the raw data, and maybe go into several years of ACS data and of course, a lot of data sets like the ACS and the CPS aren't very good because they don't give you, they don't necessarily indicate they have a some college category, but not degrees or credentials short of a BA. So we thought the crosswalk was the best way to do this. And again, these crosswalks are messy. So first of all, within SIP codes, even very detailed, the certificates and the associate degrees map to very different occupations. So we had to sort of take that into account. And then any particular SIP code at either the certificate or the associate level, would then match to a whole bunch of different SOC codes. So, the weighted average of those is, let's say you have 10 different SOC codes, and the top one is 40% of all the people with that SIP credential, and the bottom one is 6. Well, then you would allocate when you did your weighted average of the annual earnings of those, and we got the annual earnings also from the ACS, but you would, put 40% weight on the one and maybe 6% weight on the other. So it was that type of exercise. And there were all kinds of questions we had to wrestle with, like, do we do this at the college level? The sample sizes will be too small. So I think we mostly did it at the state level. My colleague Paul Butler at AIR did all of this empirical work, and he could go into more detail if anyone had more questions.
So another follow-up question I'll ask is, do you guys look at how different state governments are you defining the term credentials of value? You might know there are many states that have created their own credential value lists, and oftentimes those lists have varying criteria. There's actually quite, although most are somehow related to, like you said, as you studied here, occupational demand, either demand for occupations in the labor market or earnings. Can you say a little bit more about whether you were trying to align with, what different states were doing, or how you hope to inform that discussion that states are having about how do they define what is a credential value?
We didn't look at the state definitions. When we started, we had our own conception of how to do that. You're right that, boy, in the last 3 or 4 years, this has exploded as an area of interest, and a lot of states are defining that in very different ways. I'm a very interesting effort. The Lumina Foundation has a project called Future Ready States, and they're helping 12 states to define credentials of value, and then
Right.
what kind of data you need. So I think that's going to be a great project. It's still in its early stages, and we will certainly follow that work. And then we'll see how closely what the states do compare to our own definitions. But we haven't done that yet.
So I see that Holly has entered the chat. Holly, if you would like to come off mute and ask your question about what about grants that colleges might have received and what they're doing.
Everyone, I actually had 3 questions.
Yeah, go for it.
So I like the term, well, you're using the term excelling colleges versus the others, but I'm wondering, are the excelling colleges, I heard you say they're braiding funding, but could you say more about are they recipients of some major foundation grants, and are they typically engaging in networks like you just mentioned that Lumina project with 10 states? So are some of those excelling colleges already in networks where they're learning from one another, so that might be stimulating them? And the third related question is, are some certain industries in those regional contexts really driving the excelling? What is your take? So I guess I have those three questions. Thanks.
I can take the first one, Harry, and then pass it to you, maybe. Okay. Yeah, I was just, Holly, pulling up the report to go back and dig into your question about funding. The excelling colleges did talk about state workforce initiatives, federal grants like WIOA, Perkins 5, of course, but also things like employer sponsorships and ARPA, using ARPA resources, but also foundation dollars to support low or no cost training. I think the excelling colleges did also talk about using a variety of sources, but I think what stood out is, sometimes the excelling colleges had specific offices or points of contact that were strategically thinking about identifying these funding sources and how they could leverage them together to translate that to students at low or no cost. If that answers your question. I don't know about the learning communities. Harry, I don't know if you can address that question at all.
I really can't. Again, I think it's an important question. I don't know that many of them spoke about that in the qualitative interviews. The extent to which industry drives a lot of this, as Rachel said, the nature. I mean, every college says they are engaged with employers, but the nature of that engagement, I think, is quite important. And the ones where the engagement is really intentional and structured and several times a year, in those places, I would guess that industry needs are really kind of, it stands to reason that industry needs would be driving a lot of what we see. And just there's other interesting work on this. Nicola Lowe at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, wrote a book on how both 2-year and 4-year colleges interact with the biotech industry in North Carolina, and you really get a strong sense of the important role that industry plays, especially with successful community colleges. So I would think that is an important variable.
So anyone can jump in at any time into the conversation. I can keep going with my own questions, but actually, Nuoy, if you'd like to come off mute and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so I see like there are 25 community college and especially the leaders' voice are included. I'm wondering if like you consider the leaders' voice only or you consider students' voice as well, because we know like leaders are kind of interested in introducing their programs or their like directions, I would say a little bit specific ways. So any consideration about students or other, yeah.
Well, we thought of that. We just didn't have the money to do that. And we should acknowledge we got generous funding from both Smith Richardson and Harvard from the Reimagining Economies project at Harvard. But with the limited resources we had, we really had to be very economical about how we used it. And so we decided to go with people whom we thought would know more. And some other work, AIR did a lot of work with the City Colleges of Chicago, a consortium of 7 colleges in the Chicago area. And we actually did a paper talking to students about how they make their choices about what to major in and how they think about careers. And interestingly, very little of it was driven by accurate perceptions of salary, things like that. So I think you're right. It's certainly something to take into account because again, you're often very struck by how different the student perceptions can be. We just couldn't do it within the confines of this study.
So I'll ask a follow-on question, which is, something I've always wondered, throughout many of the presentations we've had, and much of the work has been done at the NCRN, is this, feel like looming in the background, there's a question of student demand, which is that we can talk about all day about which fields of study have the greatest labor market returns, but it's student demand may not line up perfectly with labor market demand. In colleges, it seems to me that they often have to be, they're kind of stuck in between what employers say they want and what employers say they want in graduates and what students say they want to learn. I was especially wondering, in Rachel, some of your qualitative research, did that tension come up? Did you learn about or ask how colleges are thinking about how to deal with that sort of discrepancy between what learners may be looking for and what the labor market rewards?
The short answer is no. I don't remember having any explicit interviews that talked about that directly, and we didn't actually ask about it. It's a good point. Harry, I don't know if you would add.
We didn't have anything in our study on that, but there is an economics literature on the extent to which enrollments in field of study are driven by relative salary rankings. And by the way, most of that literature is about the 4-year colleges, and you find that those things play some role, but it's a much looser correlation than you might expect. At the 2-year colleges, it strikes me you have 2 very different populations. You have the young people, coming right out of high school, and then you have the older, non-traditional adult student population. My guess is that the adults have a much clearer idea of why they need whichever credentials they're pursuing, and they're often already in the field. Whereas I think for the younger folks, uh, let's say the correlation is much weaker. I did some research with my Calder colleagues at AIR just on the extent to which students bounce around in community colleges, often when they don't know, and when they may have difficulty passing the gateway classes in fields like healthcare, and how much they bounce around. And it does point to the fact that career advising, guided pathways and things like that could be very important for this younger student population. But unfortunately, we couldn't look at it.
So I would.
So another, go ahead.
I was just going to take the question in a different direction. I don't know, Kyle, were you following up?
Yeah, but Michelle, please jump in.
Okay. I was just curious on your recommendation around work-based learning and noting that that was an important characteristic. I was curious, maybe this is going beyond into sort of the next stage of some of the work you want to do, but I was curious how you were seeing, how are the colleges actually achieving that goal, because it's often a really hard thing to kind of have work-based learning at any meaningful scale, just because it's very labor intensive and it's difficult to engage employers and make those connections. And I was curious what you saw in some of the high-performing schools in terms of how they did that, like administratively or funding wise, or just organizationally. How did they get work-based learning to a scalable place?
Yeah, I can't speak to like which particular strategies were, like the funding piece of it, but I know that a lot of times colleges that had really strong relationships with employers were able to then make those connections a little bit better in terms of doing like a capstone project, for example, where a student is able to engage directly with an employer and have a real sort of work experience, even though it's not, a formal apprenticeship, but some more opportunities like that, sort of driven by pre-existing relationships with employers. So it doesn't get at the how to make those relationships, but sort of like that's sort of an important prerequisite to building out those work-based learning opportunities.
And just to reinforce what Rachel said, again, from our City Colleges of Chicago work, we researchers are sort of talk a lot about apprenticeship these days. And yet we know, the take up of apprenticeships is often low, and the vast majority of employers, especially smaller ones, that's way too big a leap for a lot of them. So what we did in that CCC work is to kind of prepare, a menu of different kinds of work-based learning, also including internships and co-op projects and things like that, and then just to try to meet the employers where they are, and which of these options they think they can engage in. And my sense is that, especially from reading a lot of what Rachel and Amy did, is the excelling colleges are just better at that, of sort of figuring out where the employers are, and where they could nudge them to do this more effectively.
So it sounds like that's sort of an open question, is how do they engage with those employers so effectively? Or do you have any impressions on what are some of the reasons why they may be more effective there?
I don't. I'm not sure, Rachel, if you have any.
Yeah, maybe not the reasons, Michelle, but the sort of the ways in which they worked and engaged. I think we heard, that constant engagement, bringing in faculty who have connections to employers who come from industry, but also who continue to engage with industry and sort of bring those relationships to schools. Some schools have, like a really robust like employer engagement role or arm, and so they're really thoughtful and thinking about making those employer connections. And a lot of that's resource driven too. The colleges who have the resources to have those type of business engagement type roles have the money to do that. But that was another, I think, factor that we heard from excelling colleges, that just having the space to focus on employer connections and engagement was a potential facilitator there for sure. I don't know if that answers your question, but I definitely think there's more to explore there, because I get that question a lot.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think a lot of folks are trying to figure that out.
Well, maybe on a slightly related note, you talked about in the report you discussed the industry advisory groups and employer relationships, and then you started talking about labor market information, and it looks like, I was looking at page 21 of the report, you mentioned that 32% rather of excelling colleges and about 50% of aspiring colleges reported they used labor market information as a assessed need for new programs, or to align programs with the labor market. My first question is, was that finding surprising to you? To be honest, it's a little bit lower than I might have expected, but I was curious if you also had a sense of to what extent are they using, like you referenced Lightcast or other sorts of private vendors. Do you have a sense of what, for the average college, what that looks like, what that kind of data analysis operation looks like? And are they looking at just certain programs, or are they looking across the entire curriculum?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Harry, if you want to add too. I think in the interviews, because of I'll just a little bit of a caveat too. These interviews were based on semi-structured protocols. So I think I will just say, just because somebody didn't say explicitly that they did something doesn't mean that they don't.
Yeah.
But I think here a lot of times too, we weren't talking to the people who would be doing the analysis or using, themselves. So I think they would just mention sort of at a higher level that yes, we do look at data, or, to make our decisions, but there wasn't a lot more detail shared about the nitty gritty of what that looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Rachel's correct on that. Using data can be daunting to a lot of these folks who have no idea which data to start with, and how do you use it and interpret it. So I think a lot of them rely more heavily on what they hear from the local employers, rather than formal data use per se. I think the best places know how to use the data. Again, the bigger colleges have dedicated personnel to that data, and then know how to combine it with their interactions with employers to get a sense. Because when they're developing curricula, they want to not just based on where you have a lot of vacancies today, but how it's going to evolve over the next 3-5 years. So the best places, I think, are figuring out how to use the LMI with the employer interactions. But for a lot of places, they just haven't developed that yet, that sense.
And Holly, you have a comment. I don't know if you want to say more about how coordinating boards might affect.
Just a governor's comment. If it was an unstructured interview and they didn't mention things, I just have always thought, or that at least the states I've lived in, that community colleges are required to have their programs approved by either their coordinating board or a Department of Ed or whatever their governance structure is, and that all of them are required to put data about the projections of workforce placements and all this stuff into their program requests. So I'd be highly surprised that if they didn't have to do that. Now, some obviously would do it better. I take Carrie's point that some are going to have better staff or IR staff to do that. But in fact, I think they need that. So that just would surprise me if they didn't do that.
Well, it might be what Rachel said, that it's other people in the institution who are doing it, not well known by the people whom we were interviewing. That's certainly a possibility.
I guess one final question I have is, about skills. Skills are also another kind of topic that was not directly that we often miss in analyses when we're looking directly at occupational demand and matches with occupational demand and earnings. But when community colleges are talking to employers, they're talking about which occupations are in demand, but are also identifying cross-functional skills that might be in demand? Are they thinking about that did you have a sense of how employers are thinking about skills and building that in as they also think about what to them, would be a credential value?
Yeah, employers, so people like Joe Fuller at Harvard have often spoken about this mismatch, this big gulf between how colleges think about this stuff and how employers think about it. I think it's true that employers care a lot less about credentials and curricula. They just want to know that people can perform the tasks that need to be performed on the job. And of course, there's a whole movement right now towards skill-based hiring, where less weight is put on the credential, whereas colleges are still very focused on curriculum and credential. So, yeah, my sense is that employers care about that less. Colleges also, of course, it's not about pleasing any one set of employers. They want skills to be portable across jobs and across firms and even potentially across industries. So that's going to be something that any particular employee doesn't care about, but the colleges correctly focus on. So I think there's that dance between the employers and the colleges, and the colleges really trying to translate the sectoral training programs, the best of which, like Perscolis are not at community colleges, but some like Project Quest are. They're really good at having intermediaries that can translate employer skill needs into curricula at the colleges and credentials. So I think there's some cases where people are good at that, and maybe some where they're less good or they have less help with it. And Rachel, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just to add, we didn't talk to employers, so we don't have sort of that lens. But just to add to what Harry said, and I think we sometimes did hear about feedback loops, right? And that it's that sort of like ongoing engagement with employers. So, we did hear colleges working with a large, health system, and a lot of their relationships are very close. The employers are coming in and assessing curriculum and making sure that relevant skills are being addressed, and they're giving colleges feedback, right? If they're seeing students come in, graduates come in, and they're not having the skills that they need, and so there's that sort of iterative feedback loop in places where mostly the excelling colleges with those strong partnerships.
Well, seeing no further questions, I think that we can adjourn today's webinar. Our speakers' email addresses are in the chat, so feel free to reach out with any further questions, and please do take a look at the report, which is on the AIR website.
Thanks so
All
much.
right, thank you both.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.